We did finally just get a ton of water, which we needed the rain. We have had a little bit of a drier winter, and so we're just constantly worried about fire up here. Excellent. Let's see, looks like. Oh, people are starting to join, so we'll just give it another minute or so and let everybody filter in. Even though it's like ice hailing on us, I still have allergies, so I don't know how that works. But
Joy of spring.
yes, isn't that fun? All the things at once. All right, welcome everybody who's joining. We're just going to give it another minute or so, and then we'll get going. Try to not sniff all the way through the introduction. All right, looks like we just turned to 4 o'clock, so we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you, everyone, for joining us for our Thursday webinar. Before I introduce our distinguished speakers, we just have a few introductory announcements. If you're joining us for the first time, we are Crow Canyon Archaeological Center. We're a nonprofit research and education center here in Southwest Colorado. During the webinar, if you can put your questions in the Q&A rather than in the chat where they can get lost, we will make sure to take a look at them and get to them. We're not streaming live on Facebook again this week. We're going to continue to try to work the kinks out of that one, but you will be able to go back and watch us on our YouTube channel. If you have not subscribed, please do. We now have years worth of incredible webinars loaded up there, and I often go back and look at them myself. We'd like to begin with some acknowledgements. Crow Canyon Archaeological Center acknowledges the Pueblo, Ute, Paiute, Dene, and Jicarilla Apache people on whose traditional homelands our campus sits. With the work we're doing at Crow Canyon, we seek to bring light into the darkness of memory that these lands, waters, wildlife, and her descendants hold as a result of policies of removal, genocide, and displacement. We seek paths that support and align with Indigenous people and communities, and with gratitude, we honor the contributions of present-day Indigenous communities, descendants, and the colleagues with whom we partner, who help guide our work and our mission every day. We have some announcements this week. Our spring newsletter is out, so you can find it on the website at crowcanyon.org, and you can also scan the QR code here. Lots of great updates, particularly about our spring programs. We also have some new information out on some of our projects. Like many nonprofits, we are struggling with loss of federal funding for some amazing programs. And I won't go into them, but please do scan and take a look at some of these programs here. Our upcoming webinars we have coming up next week. We have Domestication, the Beginning or the End of Community Relationships with Ade Romero Briones, who is amazing if you have not met or seen her before. And then the week after that, on the 22nd, we have Staking Futures Together, Mediating Conflict Through Games in Ancient North America with Dr. Gabriel Yanicki. So a couple of amazing webinars coming up, so please do join us. I want to do, as we always do at this point, a huge thank you. We are a nonprofit supported almost entirely by generosity, and this webinar series, which is entirely free, also supported by all of you. So I want to do a huge thank you to everyone who's donated, who donates when they register for the webinars. And in particular, as we talked about last week, we have suffered the loss of our colleague, Taylor Hasbrook, who originated this entire webinar series, and people have been donating in her name all week. So thank you all so much. It means a great deal to us to have your support and your remembrances of Taylor. We're so grateful. Without further ado, I am so excited to introduce our speaker today. Dr. Kisha Supernant is the director of the Institute of Prairie and Indigenous Archaeology and is a professor in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Alberta. Her research focuses on Métis archaeology, digital archaeology, and heart-centered archaeological practice. Dr. Supernant collaborates extensively with Indigenous communities in Western Canada, emphasizing ethical research relationships and Indigenous rights to cultural heritage. Her work integrates Indigenous ways of knowing into archaeological processes, from excavation to interpretation. Using geographic information systems and remote sensing, she supports Indigenous communities to tell their stories and reclaim their cultural heritage. She leads the Exploring Métis Identity Through Archaeology, a collaborative research project which takes a relational approach to exploring the material past of Métis communities, including her own family in Western Canada. Dr. Supernant has also been at the forefront of using technology to locate and protect unmarked graves near residential schools over the past several years. Her scholarly contributions include peer-reviewed journal publications, co-edited books, media interviews, and knowledge mobilization initiatives. She is the chair of the Canadian Archaeological Association's Working Group on Unmarked Graves, which received the 2024 Governor's General Innovation Award. Dr. Supernant's achievements led to her induction into the Royal Society of Canada's College of New Scholars, Artists, and Scientists in 2021, and she received the Dorothy Killam Fellowship in 2023. Dr. Supernant, we're so grateful to have you. I've been a bit of a fangirl since I saw your first webinar on heart-centered archaeology, which we actually showed to our entire board and staff, and I'm just so excited that we have you in person with us today at Crook Canyon.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that very kind introduction, and it's great to be here with all of you today. So Tanse, Kisha Supernanitsika-san, Amishkuchiwiskaiga no Chinia, Tipimisiwaknia. I begin by introducing myself in one of my ancestral languages, which is Cree. My family spoke many different languages over many generations, and I'm here to share with you my perspective on what archaeology can and maybe should be thinking about the future. So I'm going to touch on a number of the things that my bio mentioned, including some of my work with my own community, and I will also be speaking to you a little bit about the broad work of using archaeological applications of geographic information systems, remote sensing, and geophysics to help locate potential unmarked graves. When I reach that point of the presentation, I will provide a warning because it is a very difficult subject. So you did receive an introduction to some of my scholarly work, and I also wanted to provide a little bit of information about my connection to my own community. So I'm a citizen of the Otipemisiwak Métis government in Alberta. I'm part of the Métis Nation, which is a post-contact Indigenous people recognized as one of the 3 distinct Indigenous peoples within the nation we now call Canada. My family roots run very deep in the province of Alberta, which is where I'm situated today. I'm coming to you from Amiskwichiwiskaigan, which is the Cree name for Edmonton, Alberta, Canada, basically straight shot up the Rockies from where Crow Canyon is located. And that's really important to me to attend to my own relations on my father's side of the family in Alberta, but also back to Red River, Manitoba, which is now Winnipeg. And then on my mom's side, I'm British settler. So that's relatively recent British settlers as well. I'm going to start with a big question to sort of situate the work that I do and what I want to share with you today. And I start with a big question in part because I think it's a very fundamental one. And as people interested in or practicing archaeology, one of the fundamental questions is, why do we do it? What is the purpose? What is the end goal? And certainly when I was an undergraduate student, I was always taught that archaeology is the telling of human history through the material record using scientific methods for the good of humanity. So there was a very strong sense of we are the tellers of that material history that is not necessarily written down in the history books, and something that really benefits all of humanity. And one of the things that I've come to reflect on as an Indigenous archaeologist is, where does that assumption come from that archaeologists are the tellers of histories, especially in places where those histories are not being told by the descendants of the people who made them. And this is an important thing to think about, especially because there are places around the world where the people who are telling archaeological, stories, the histories of those places, doing those archaeological analyses, are descendants of the people who made those archaeological records. And I think that that's important. But it's important to understand the difference between those places and places where there is a history of colonization, and particularly settler colonialism, where the people who came and colonized remain the dominant society. And that includes North America, parts of South America, Australia, New Zealand, and some other places as well. And it is in these contexts where I think the question about what gives non-Indigenous people the right to tell Indigenous stories is a really fundamental one. And that is connected with the colonial project in many kinds of ways, because archaeology, as those of us who practice it know, it is very much the act of taking things out of the ground and learning about those histories, but that is an extractive process. It extracts things out of the earth in order to understand what was happening prior to the current moment. And it also can be very, very extractive of knowledge, right? It tends to write the histories of those places in ways that can exclude, marginalize Indigenous peoples. Now, we of course know that that is shifting, but this is the fundamental premise behind a lot of archaeology throughout the 20th century, certainly. And the reason that non-Indigenous people were empowered to use the material of the past to tell those stories is because of colonization and because of the histories of erasure, the histories of assuming that Indigenous people, even if we were to continue to exist, would not actually be the same as we were before, and therefore would have no kind of relationship with those places and materials of the past. Also, there was a strong emphasis, and I would say remains a strong emphasis, on the kind of empirical and scientific nature of what archaeology brings, and can center sort of archaeological science as one of the most powerful tools to tell histories, the kind of true or right history of a place. We see this in many aspects of archaeology, but I think one of the most prominent and obvious is in when we talk about the history of human migration and peopling of the Americas and the discussions around that. It tends to really center radiocarbon dating and analysis of certain types of artifacts as the way of saying this is when people arrived here, even when Indigenous peoples know their own histories and stories in different kinds of ways. So this idea of overwriting Indigenous history with scientific approaches to history is very much at the core of how archaeology has been, and often in many cases, continues to be practiced. And then who does archaeology is also a really important question. The vast majority of archaeologists in colonial contexts are not Indigenous, and they're also not necessarily diverse in other ways. And this means the stories that can be told, the questions that can be asked, are fundamentally limited because they're based on particular kinds of cultural experiences and situatedness. So I have talk a lot about archaeology's potential for what I call restorative justice. And this is a framework which informs all of my archaeological work, whether it be working with communities to address very real concerns about unmarked graves of children who were taken, or whether it means working with my own community to try to restore our own history and our own stories. And those both, to me, fall within this realm of restorative justice. And this is a couple of things I want to highlight here. One, it's not a stepping away from the possibilities that archaeology brings to the table. Archaeology is a suite of tools and methods that are actually can be quite powerful and quite important. It's more so how are they being applied is what I look at. First, it's thinking about the ways that archaeology itself can be used to seek redress or tell the stories of historical and ongoing wrongs. We see a lot of this work in sort of African diaspora archaeology, archaeologies of enslavement, where it's uncovering these histories and these stories which are not often centered or told. It's also really centering community needs. The work that I do now is very much grounded in what communities ask me to do. And then I think about what are the archaeological ways we could address those needs and interests and develop the kind of research program that would meet those needs. It's looking at questions of justice. And here, the most obvious example is when I'm doing geophysical survey of a residential school site. It's very possible that that work could end up in a court case or in a criminal investigation. And how can we responsibly use archaeological knowledge to support those questions and also recognize the possibilities and limitations of what archaeology can do? I always think about a more inclusive and broader archaeology that includes many different voices and perspectives is, in fact, one that is a much richer storying of the past because archaeology can provide some really important information about what happened in the past, but it's not the only story. And in fact, when we open up that space and think about those multiplicity of voices, it in fact leads to much better understandings and interpretations and storying of the past. And then there's also a role, of course, for archaeology to facilitate the return of belongings and ancestors. I'm in Canada, situated in a place where we don't have any kind of framework for returning of ancestors or belongings. In the United States, of course, there's NAGPRA, and these are ways that archaeology can help support the return of belongings, ancestors, and in some cases, even land. So it was mentioned in the intro that one of the ways in which I approach the restorative justice aspect is actually through heart-centered archaeology. And this is the edited volume that I had the great pleasure of working on with Jane Baxter, Natasha Lyons, and Sonia Atelier, along with a number of amazing archaeologists who responded to our invitation to imagine an approach to archaeology that wasn't just an intellectual pursuit, but one that was really starting from the heart rather than the head. In the introduction, Natasha Lyons and I talk about 4 chambers of heart-centered archaeology, which are care, emotion, relation, and rigor. And we see these really at the heart of the approach in general. This is centering care for ourselves, for each other, and for the ancient peoples and lives that we have the privilege of studying. It's about creating safe environments within archaeological practice and recognizing that when we care about our work and when we center care, we actually do a better job. I'm a better archaeologist because I care about the work that I'm doing, and I care about the ways in which I use archaeology to, for example, address community needs. I'm not going to undermine the archaeological practice and the archaeological work that I do in order to tell the community something that they want to hear. That's not care. An ethic of care really centers what the possibilities and limitations are of the work that we do, and making sure that we create space for many different people. We also really want to invite emotion into the space in a different kind of way than we've seen in the literature broadly. There are a few scholars who definitely have stepped into this space long before we did, but it's still not common practice to recognize that emotion is actually an extremely powerful way to know. And when we think about it as something we have to suppress, limit, or try to avoid when we're doing our work, I think we're doing ourselves a disservice because it can be a very powerful way to understand. And the kind of emotional responses that we have today to the work that we do are important, but it's also really important to recognize that ancient people also had emotions, even if we can't necessarily assume their emotions are the same as ours. We know they had them, and sometimes decisions that people make are emotional ones and not necessarily based on other aspects of behavior. And so I think there's a lot of opportunity to explore what the role of emotion might mean, both in our practice today, but also in how we understand ancient peoples. And there are many scholars in this volume who explore different ways in which that can be applied. The third chamber is relation, and this is really where we draw a lot of connection and inspiration from Indigenous archaeologies and Indigenous ways of knowing, and I will come back to that a little bit later, recognizing that at the core of for me, at the core of ethical archaeology, certainly in settler colonial context, is being in good relation with each other, with communities, with lands and waters, and that is in those relations with respect to boundaries and power and knowing the different positionality that we come from, that in fact the most interesting research questions can often emerge. And then the fourth chamber is rigor. One of the critiques that we often get when we're talking about things like emotion and care is like, well, but we have to be unbiased and scientific and objective. We're human. By being unbiased is not actually possible. It's really important that we are upfront about our biases and understand how they are situated within our research. But it's also this idea that when we are aware of those aspects, the emotion, the bias, and the care, it's really important then that we do really good archaeology, right? So I care a lot about doing very, very good work, meeting the highest possible standards of what archaeology can do, in order to, in fact, advance those needs of communities that I mentioned before. And I think also what I find interesting is in this space of rigor, the questions that communities ask me about the archaeological record often force me to think about the science that I do differently, or to expand it, or to apply it in ways that I hadn't maybe thought of before. And to me, that's also an important part of sort of advancing what we can actually know and learn with archaeology itself. So these four chambers are really at the heart of all of the work that I do, and many of my colleagues as well. So that's the kind of framework in which I work. And now I wanted to take the opportunity to share with you, what does this actually look like in practice? Because it's one thing to talk about it, but I want to actually demonstrate how that applies to two contexts in which I've spent most of my last 10 years of my career focusing on. The first is Métis archaeology, so the archaeology of my own nation and community. And then I will move later into the work around finding the children. For me, the main motivation for doing Métis archaeology was the fact that I didn't grow up with my community, and I didn't because of colonialism and the ongoing dispossession of our people. My father was taken from his mother at birth, raised in foster care, and I've spent the majority of my adult life coming back home to my community. And one thing I noticed along the journey was that our story is not well understood, both at a sort of a family level, but also at a nation level. A lot of the history of our nation is told by other people, and there's a lot that we need to do to reclaim our stories. And so I want to tell the stories of my ancestors, three of which are represented on this slide. Those are my great-great-grandparents in the photo, Alexis Supernant and Marie-Flora Gaucher, both born in Alberta. He was born in the 1870s and her in the 1880s. And then the document is my three times great-grandmother, who was part of the Papas First Nation, who was dispossessed. She married a Métis man, and she took what's called Métis script, which is what this document shows. And I want to know about their lives. I want to know about their struggles. I want to know about their history. And that's part of what really motivates me to use archaeology to explore where we were and what we were doing around the time that these folks were born and children. One of the other big motivating factors is the fact that the term Métis remains misunderstood in many cases. It's partly because it is, in fact, the French word for mixed. So métis or métissage is often used to talk about a mixture of some kind. It was one of the terms applied to my ancestors and my family that now is very much at the heart of our nation as we understand ourselves. And it is true that the origin of who we are as a distinct nation did begin between marriages and relationships between Indigenous women and primarily European fur traders, either from France or from Scotland. And the big thing to note here is that it's not that mixedness which defines us. It is part of the definition, but it is not the sole definition. I am not Métis because I have a Cree great-grandmother. That's not how it works. I am Métis because the children of unions, that first generation, married children from very similar unions. And in my family, that happened for 4 generations, where you have people who were, out of these original unions, marrying into similar kinds of families, creating community and that sort of thing. So it is not simply a matter of being Indigenous and non-Indigenous, it is in fact a matter of being Métis for many generations. And we are also a nation with a political history as well. The first time that our nation was sort of declared was in 1816. There was what we call the victory at Broad Plain and what the British call the Battle of Sevenoaks, where some of my relatives raised a flag and declared ourselves a new nation. When the Dominion of Canada was established in 1867, we resisted the Dominion of Canada. It's often called a rebellion, but it's in fact a resistance led by the fellow in the center of the image here, Louis Riel, who was very, very well known, and then a council of people who said, we do not recognize your authority and we will resist it. And that led to the founding of the province of Manitoba. And then there was a second resistance about 15 years later when Canada was not upholding its end of that agreement. After which, we were defeated, Louis Riel was hung, and we had about 100 years of pretty severe dispossession in our families before we have really come back together and reclaimed who we are over the past 30, 35 years. So within that context, I was really interested when I was on my journey of reconnecting of what archaeology had been done on this emergent post-contact collective culture and nation. And the answer is not very much, even though in fact, from an archaeological perspective, it is also very interesting to look at emergence of new collective identities, and certainly an anthropological question that has been wrestled with for, 150 years. So when I looked at some of the archaeology that had been done on Métis sites, recognized Métis sites, and this had been done in the 1970s and 1980s, I was a little bit frustrated, I think, by the approach. It was reflective of the time, but at the same time, the emphasis was on our mixedness. It was this idea that, looking for, European and First Nations goods, or emphasizing that Métis women were trying to emulate their European cousins by the use of particular objects. And there was a strong emphasis on sort of hybridity and creolization, sort of looking for mixed traits. And this led to some of the interpretations doing things like dismissing First Nations traditions at Métis sites, including stone tool making, which I'll come back to. And I was reading through this and being like, well, these aren't the right questions that are being asked, because the entire framework was looking for our mixedness rather than looking for our distinctness as a people. And this has had me reflecting a lot on how this plays out in archaeology more broadly. So I'm just going to pull us back out for a minute and thinking about what archaeology does with the materials that we find in archaeological sites. And it's all about putting them into various boxes, right? So it is, whether that be the material type, whether that be the style that we're working with, whether that be time, putting them in boxes of time, different kinds of taxonomies regarding what animal species are represented. Everything that archaeologists were trained to do in archaeology is to separate things out into smaller and smaller and smaller pieces, and then categorize them, and then analyze those categories in different configurations, sometimes going back up in the taxonomy, sometimes at that lower level. But it's all about separation of things into small pieces, and everything becomes objectified. Everything becomes an object to study. So belongings of ancestors become objects and specimens, things that are weighed and measured and photographed and analyzed, and then protected in very particular kinds of ways, curated in very particular kinds of ways. And the challenge with these, the ways in which we approach this is very much a Western European Enlightenment way to approach the world, and breaking it into smaller and smaller parts. Many scientific disciplines that we see today do this, right? Whether it be biology or physics or chemistry, it's always about these sort of categories of things. And even the division between academic disciplines can echo some of that as well. And as someone who's, spent a lot of time coming back to knowledge holders and elders in my community and trying to make sense of the world from our perspective as Indigenous people, that separation doesn't actually make a lot of sense because it's in fact the connections between things, how they are interrelated and interwoven, that gives us a sense of how we are in the world. So this is for me one of the sort of fundamental differences between Western ways of knowing and Indigenous ways of knowing. Within those big categories, of course, there's nuance and distinctness, but some of the core concepts are just the different ways in which we understand our relations in the world, and then how that applies to the way we make sense of the past. So when I'm doing Métis archaeology, I really wanted to bring a different perspective to even thinking about the archaeological process itself. So I started the Exploring Métis Identity Through Archaeology project, started in partnership with Métis Nation and exploring research questions that matter to my community. And every time I apply for the next round of granting, which I'm doing right now, I'm going back to community and saying, okay, here's what we learned. What do you want to do now? How do we build from here? There's also an emphasis on less invasive methods. So we do excavation, but we do so in very targeted ways, and usually after using methods that don't involve excavation to start with. This includes remote sensing and geophysics, and working with community to identify locations. And then moving from that kind of approach to looking at Métis sites archaeologically to doing a Métis archaeology, which is a fundamentally different thing in how I approach it. Moving away from those questions of sort of hybridity and creolization to ones that are more focused on who we are as a distinct people. And this is the framework that I use where I think about the interrelated nature of different aspects of our lives as Métis people. This includes our mobility. We were known for, well, we have a vast homeland, which covers most of Western Canada and a good chunk of the Northern United States as well. But we moved across that landscape in important ways. The geography of the homeland, so the different spaces in which we moved, the different kinds of ecozones and biomes that we move through, our relations with lands and waters, our daily life, sort of the rhythm of that daily life of what did our lives look like, what materials were we using, what kind of food were we eating, the things that archaeology can often be really good to use to illuminate. And then our economy, our economic practice, were we fur traders or farmers? Were we bison hunting? Were we working for fur trading companies? These all have implications materially for the kind of work, the kind of things that we see. And you'll notice that the dominant thread here is Métis relations. And this is partly because this image is actually a representative of a very important symbol in our communities of a sash. So we use, and we still today use sashes as a symbol. They were also very practical. They're long and they're hand woven. And the whole point here is that the biggest part of understanding Métis history is in actually that interweaving. And the most important thread is Métis relations. So the dominant color is red, and the dominant thread here is relations. And it's not that I can pull it on any one of these threads and look at them individually. It's that only when they're woven together, only when we're thinking of them together, does a fuller and richer picture of Métis history, Métis families, Métis belongings come to light. So I'm going to briefly give you an example from an archaeological site that I've been working on since 2013, where we're taking this approach of thinking about multiple things together. This is a type of site that Métis bison hunters, so part of our community at the time, would have been using from the 1840s to the early 1880s, after which bison hunting was no longer a viable economic option. Métis families, interconnected sets of Métis families would go out and build cabins in various parts of the homeland, and usually live in them for anywhere from 1 to 10 years over the winter. So they come back, in October, live there till about April, be on their way, sometimes come back the next season, sometimes move on. But they're important because they are very distinctly Métis sites, meaning that the vast majority of people who lived here at the time would have considered themselves Métis, part of those family connections and networks. And this is different than a site where you might have a more multinational site where you might have First Nations, Métis, Europeans, like a fur trading post. It's a little more complicated to untangle Métis material culture in those places. Here's a place where we know that these are Métis places. One of those places, there's sort of a number of them scattered throughout the homeland, but one of them that's known is called Chimney Coulee. It is about 100 miles north of the US border with Montana, and on the eastern end of an area called the Cypress Hills, which is a really interesting ecological area, very important Indigenous place. This particular site is interesting for a few reasons, and one of them is because it actually has multiple occupations in the historic period. It has a pre-contact component, which we haven't focused on, but we do know it exists there. And then it has three distinct occupations during the historic era. So there was a trading post operating here for a year in fall of 1871 to spring of 1872. There was a Métis wintering village from the 1860s to the early 1880s. And then there was a Northwest Mounted Police Post, the precursor to the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, which was established here in 1878. And we know on the site where those general occupations are. So we know where the trading post was, we know where the Northwest Mounted Police Post was, we know generally where the wintering village was. So we approached this site as a place to understand, again, that distinctness within Métis material culture, if it exists, in a comparative way with other similar era occupations, but also to establish the Métis presence here, because there had been a lot of work on the trading post, a little bit of work on the Northwest Mounted Police Post, no work on the Métis wintering village. So we mapped the site, we applied various forms of geophysics to it, we did some targeted excavation. I also want to mention that one of the aspects of the approach that I take is also integrating ceremony as appropriate in the work that I do. So as Métis people, we have sort of a combination of both folks who use more traditional First Nations style ceremony, as well as many of the Métis now and in the past were practicing Christians, particularly Catholics. So I actually do both a Catholic prayer and a Cree prayer before beginning the work, and respecting those two traditions, which is also a really important part of the approach. So just wanted to talk a little bit about some of the archaeology, and then I want to share with you a little bit about the beadwork that we found here. We did do remote sensing and near surface geophysics of a variety of ways, and this has become an important application, as I mentioned before, about looking for where we might want to excavate to answer the questions that communities have, while doing as little ground disturbance as possible. And in this particular case, one of the highlights, and we published about this in 2021, where we were able to use a high frequency ground penetrating radar unit, a 900 megahertz, if you know much about GPR, in order to really get a detailed look at the top 40 to 50 centimeters of the ground. And that's the majority of where the Métis occupation is at this site. And we were actually able to use that to detect the cabin wall, which would have been made out of wood. And we can actually see and kind of trace the woody trench that is associated with that cabin wall in the ground penetrating radar. And we actually know that because we ground truthed it. So we were able to come down and actually see the wall after we had done some geophysics, and determine that that's what, in fact, it was that we were seeing. And that allowed us also to interpret what was happening both inside and outside of the cabin with the belongings of the ancestors. One of the other aspects that taking a Métis approach to archaeology has shifted at these sites is we are really careful about designing methods to find the maximum amount of beads. So Métis were and are known as amazing bead workers. We have distinct beadwork styles. And in fact, one of the terms in Indigenous language for us is the flower beadwork people. That was how frequently we use these different patterns. And this work would have been done by women primarily, both for adorning members of their family. It was also an economic practice that was often used to sell in various markets and through various trading networks. So beads are very, very common in Métis archaeological sites if we are designing methods to find them. And this involves putting everything through window screen and using water screening methods. So when we do this, we find thousands upon thousands upon thousands of beads. We also find fragments of many other things, but beads are very common. Most of the time we find them loose in cabin floors, in various kinds of activity areas. Occasionally, we get lucky and we, in this case at Chimney Coulee, found a part of a pattern. So this is a set of intact beads that were in their original pattern in which they were made, uh, preserved through, kind of a set of circumstances that continues to amaze me. But it's very rare, of course, to find things intact. And we actually see very similar uses of colors and styles of beadwork from the same era. So the image on the slide here is from, I think, the 1870s, Métis beadwork, and the beadwork piece that we see here is probably also from the 1870s. And it was a really amazing find. We were able to use methods to stabilize the soil, to remove it intact, and brought it back to the University of Alberta, where we were doing some analysis of it. While we were doing that analysis, I started to get a strong sense that it was not super happy. And this comes back to that, question of how do I approach things as an Indigenous person? This particular set of beads in this pattern, I was, having to do a bunch of adding chemicals to the soil and having it in a very sterile environment. And I got a strong sense that it was not particularly happy there. And this brought me back to a really important concept in my community. And many Indigenous peoples that I've talked to from different nations have a similar kind of concept. It might be articulated a bit differently, but in general, they have one. And this is in one of my languages in Cree, this is Wakotwin. And this is often translated as sort of being related and the sort of interconnection of relations, but it also talks about reciprocal responsibilities and obligations to each other. And when this particular beautiful piece of beadwork was something that I had to bring back to the lab and we were doing all this analysis on, I started reflecting on what this meant in terms of Wakotwin. And what it means for me is that I have responsibilities to care for this as a relative. So this is not an object. This is a relative. And that changes kind of everything in how I approach the materials of my ancestors because I have to send this belonging to a museum. And my question becomes, why? And is that the right path for it? And who makes that decision? I'm not necessarily the one to make that decision, but my community collectively should be. And if maybe it shouldn't go to a museum and sit behind glass or sit in a dark room, what should happen to it? How does it need to be engaged with and visited with? And when my Métis relatives come to see me at the university right now, they visit with this relative. And that's part of Okotwin. That's actually part of my responsibility to make sure that this belonging is cared for. Now, what does that mean for all the other thousands of belongings that come out of these sites and that are held in institutions around the world? How do we need to visit with them? How do we need to care for them? What does that look like from our perspective versus from sort of a Western scientific curatorial conservation perspective? And where do those things overlap and where do they differ? But fundamentally, who gets to decide what happens to my relative? And this has really been something that has fundamentally shifted how I engage with archaeological practice in general. So that's a little bit of a whirlwind journey through some of the work that we've done in Métis archaeology, but I want to spend the last few minutes before we get to the Q&A talking about the other aspect of my work. So just as a reminder, I'm going to be talking about unmarked graves of children at Indian residential schools in Canada and talking about issues of genocide and removal. This can be a very heavy subject, so whatever you might need to do to care for yourself, I encourage you to do so. I won't be showing any specific results or specific cases or examples. We're talking about it more broadly, but it still can be very, very heavy. One of the fundamental things to note about the residential school system in Canada is that over the past 20 years, there has been a lot of work to tell the story of these institutions We had the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which was established in 2007, wrapped up its mandate in 2015 to witness the testimonies of survivors. And this gives us a solid baseline to understand the impacts of residential school on generations of Indigenous people, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit in the lands we call Canada. And it was based on the fundamental idea that we needed to be saved, we needed to be civilized because we weren't. And the best way to do so was to take the children away and to raise them in these boarding schools, take away their language, connection to culture, sense of self. And that has had reverberating effects through many generations, including in my own family. At least 150,000 children were forced to attend institutions. As a Métis person, not every Métis child was forced. Every First Nations child was. And there's different reasons for that. We know of those 150,000 that thousands never returned. They died at the schools, they died running away, partly because of the nature of the schools themselves. They were malnourished, they were mistreated, they were subject to a lot more exposure of diseases. The mortality rates in these institutions were probably on average close to 20%, which is much, much higher than the general population at the time. In addition to the fact that children died, many parents were never notified about the deaths of their children, and the places of their burial were not known, sometimes not marked, or if they were marked, are no longer known. And over the past, the last couple decades really, but especially over the past 4 years, the search is underway to try to locate these graves across the country. I want to be very clear. The work that's happening right now is not to prove that children died. That is a well-established historical fact. We're trying to figure out where they might be buried. That's the work right now. In May of 2021, we're coming up in a couple of weeks on the 4th anniversary of the announcement from Kamloops Secwepemc in Kamloops, BC, about the potential unmarked graves of children around the residential school there, which hit national and international news. The searches have begun at many schools, and the government had been committing funding, although the future of that funding currently is not clear. And there's been a huge demand for using techniques like ground penetrating radar to search grounds around residential schools to locate potential unmarked graves. There's not nearly enough people in Canada who know how to use ground penetrating radar, let alone know how to use it for this purpose. There's a small handful, really. It's growing, but slowly. There also was a strong emphasis on we have to search, every inch of every school ground using these technologies as though that they were going to provide the answers that communities wanted and needed. And then there was a huge triggering of trauma as well. And many survivors have been telling their stories for the first time since the May of 2021. Even with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, many survivors did not actually share their testimonies during that process, and they are now. And this has brought up all kinds of challenges in our communities. Coming back to the beginning framing of the talk that I gave today, archaeology has not always had a good history with Indigenous peoples. But what I find, I guess, heartening in some ways is that when Kamloops Secwepemc made their announcement, many of us who were archaeologists, whether we're Indigenous like myself or my non-Indigenous colleagues, started getting phone calls and being asked to come and help. And this is partly because I think we've done some work to repair the relationship with Indigenous peoples. There's a much greater understanding of the history and the roles that we can play, but also the way that we use these tools, like ground penetrating radar or other geophysical techniques or remote sensing techniques. It's much more applicable to these sort of situations than, say, how an engineer might use it, or even a geophysicist or geologist might use it. We're looking for these sort of subtle features under the ground. So these things together meant that we were being asked to come to step in to help. And I don't really consider this part of my work to be research. It's much more under kind of an archaeology as service model. I don't tend to publish about any results from these surveys. I will talk about the process and how we're doing it, but never the what and the where. because I respect the sovereignty of the nations I work with, that's their data and their work, not mine to build my academic career around. And it really requires an approach to archaeology that is heart-centered, that recognizes how emotional this work is for everyone involved, whether it be survivors and their families, whether it be search teams who are coming in, whether they're Indigenous or not, whether it be when you talk to the media and how the public responds. This is a hugely impactful work that we're doing. It has to begin with community. I never do this work unless a community reaches out to me directly and says, can you come and help? It's wrapped around by ceremony. It centers the knowledge of communities first. So I don't go in and say, this is where we need to search. I go in and say, where do you think we should search? And then I try to say, okay, this might work here, this might work there. Let's try to build a plan. And in that building of that plan, say, well, ground penetrating radar can't actually locate graves with complete certainty. It really is a tool to say these are shapes that look grave-like, not to say we know for sure there's anything here. So what can we know? What can we not know? How do we provide results quickly that don't necessarily follow academic timelines, which can often be quite long? And how do we uphold Indigenous data sovereignty and recognize and make sure that the data remains in Indigenous nations? Just a couple more reflections on this. It has been a very long 4 years. Some things that I know I have learned and the folks I work with have learned is that anytime you bring out a piece of equipment to search at a residential school, there needs to be wraparound supports in place for survivors and communities and search teams. They need to be in place before we begin because it can bring up all kinds of challenges for people when they see us out there searching for the graves of children. The ceremonies and protocols have to be determined by community, and we always follow that. So as search teams, if we can be included, that's wonderful. We also respect the fact that there are some ceremonies we shouldn't be part of, but it is really important for everyone's sort of health and protection and spiritual well-being. Um, Communications are essential to this. There remains issues with how some of the results were communicated at the beginning that has led to a lot of misleading information and the rise of denialism, trying to downplay the work that we're trying to do right now, which also makes sure we need to clarify what can and cannot be known. Many communities felt like, ground penetrating radar would give them a count of children who died at residential school. It doesn't do that. It's one step in a much larger and complex process of trying to find the children. And then making sure that the data sovereignty is upheld. We've heard many horror stories around communities not getting access to the data, it being taken and kept in other places, which is really not great. There remains a lot of pretty significant barriers to this in terms of how much time it will take. This process has barely begun after 4 years. No nation is anywhere near being done. There's 140 Indian residential schools recognized in a settlement agreement. And of those, they're across the vast majority of Canada. So the scale of this issue is very complex and daunting, to be frank. There remains a need to keep coordinating between different search teams, different nations who are doing the work, ensuring best practices are being followed. And there remains an issue with capacity. There's not enough people doing this and not enough reliable places that nations can go to get support. And there remains issues around communication, both between the fact that, every given school has many nations impacted. Children were taken from many nations at any given location, and making sure that even survivors from that school know what's happening, let alone how we communicate to the public, remains a pretty significant issue. And then the last thing I'll just briefly mention is that since the announcement from Tecumloops, we've seen a pretty significant rise in denialism. And this is not necessarily saying that residential schools don't exist, but really trying to downplay the work that we're trying to do to find missing children, to try to claim that children didn't die, or if they did die, it was sort of normal expected amount of death, that we'd see in the general population. None of those things are based in reality or in fact, but they are spreading and unfortunately being platformed. And so it's really important, again, to kind of attend to how we communicate, and also recognizing that, again, the work right now is not to prove deaths. It's to try to figure out the locations, to provide the community with the opportunity for justice, accountability, and closure, and ideally for healing moving forward as well. So my, kind of just to sum up everything before we can move to a few questions is, my motivation of doing archaeology. What is archaeology? Who is it for? It's for my family, my community, to help reclaim our stories, to help resist the narratives that emerge from settler colonialism about us only being, mixed and not really giving us the full sense of our history. It also means recognizing our rights to our heritage and working for change in policy and practice, that our values as Indigenous people are centered in our own story, and that when we do archaeology from the heart and when we do it with care and emotion and relation and rigor, that we really can support restorative justice and imagine different futures for all of us in a time where, sometimes hope is hard to find. So I think I'll leave it at that for now. I want to say hi Kinniscompton, and thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Dr. Supernant. When the heart-centered archaeologies first came out, and I saw one of your first webinars on this subject, I thought, oh my gosh, this really is a roadmap, right, for other archaeologists seeking to do this who don't really know where to start. And hearing your talk today and some of the things that you shared with us, it's only become more defined since then. And I just want to thank you for that, for the massive contribution, right, to this work. The slide that you put up around respectful practices, I can see us sitting down with our projects and the projects that we want to plan and using that, right, as to question what we're doing, and then it's very actionable. So just this is huge. So thank you so much. We often get students and our staff and other folks working on these webinars. So hugely helpful to the research that people are trying to do. And we have one question that came in early on that I wanted to ask, and it's sort of perfect for why we like to do these webinars and have the audiences that we have, because it's a student who said, hello, my name is Emma. I'm of California native descent and an undergraduate at UC Berkeley. And she says, I wanted to ask, as a woman archaeologist of Indigenous descent, how do you protect yourself both physically and mentally when working on sites with your community, especially in areas that are a result of great trauma and harm, such as these residential schools?
It's a really important question. And for me, the number one answer as an Indigenous woman archaeologist is ceremony. And this will vary because, of course, our nations all have diverse sets of ceremonies and practices relating to these spaces, or even just working with ancestors or belongings. But being able to get guidance from a community. So most of the communities that I work with on the ground are ones that I'm related to, because the histories of our families are such that I have, First Nations cousins and Métis cousins, and kind of a whole network of families. And so many of them are sort of my family's related practices that I can learn from. And so being in ceremony, but also being gifted medicines. And actually, I just was in a community yesterday, gifted an eagle feather, which is a very important symbol for us. But it helps. And also making sure that I don't try to do everything for everyone. This has been an ongoing journey of sort of trying to say, okay, what can I do? Because the demand on what I do is so great. I can't possibly do it for every nation that's reached out. So where can I have the greatest impact on the most number of nations? How can I provide the best support? Building capacity and community is sort of number one. Making sure that there are those sort of actionable things that other people can take up and apply is another way to do it. But also learning to say, like, I can't do that for you right now. And if I say yes, I won't do a good job, or I'll completely burn out. I've had health problems over the last few years, which I see as a direct relationship to this work. So figuring out for myself what I can do and what I can do has been really, really important. In addition to that being wrapped around with ceremony, both when I'm in the field doing work, but also having elders in my life, on a much more regular basis who are looking out for me, praying, giving me guidance about, I grow medicines in my yard now to make sure I have it on hand for the work that I need to do. I'm
Thank
not
you.
apologizing for that, but centering it, right? Being like
Right.
spiritual well-being is part of this work.
Which is not what they teach you in a Western-centric university at
Nope.
all, right? It's the opposite.
Yeah.
So thank you. I'm sure that's incredibly helpful to the student. I have to ask, what inspired you to become an archaeologist and a Western-trained archaeologist, to then
Yeah.
take those tools and transform the discipline?
So the first piece is that, I got enamored of archaeology in my teens through the very kind of classic channels of like, ooh,
Mhm.
ancient civilizations are so cool. And my dad was really into, that's not the Métis side, he was really into like lost cities and what I
Really?
now recognize as pretty pseudo archaeology stuff. But I got
Sure.
just like, this sounds like the coolest job ever, and had some, my high school guidance counselor telling me like, you've got to go do graduate school. And I'm first generation, like I didn't know what that meant, but I was like, sure, okay, I'll do that. But the important moment for me actually as a young Indigenous woman entering into an archaeology situation was my field school was community engaged. This was in
Mm.
2001, so this was before it was
Wow.
commonplace. And we
Mhm.
worked alongside community members. We followed cultural protocols. We got sort of instruction in how to make sure we were being respectful to the ancestors who were present on the site. And the two community members we were working with took me under their wing and were hugely influential on setting a different course for me because I realized how much that place mattered to them. And it wasn't just a sort of abstract intellectual, this is cool. It was like, this is real and meaningful for us. These things have spirit, and this helps to tell our story. This helps to, reclaim who we are. And that experience was completely transformational for me and led me down a path where I wanted to do community engaged archaeology. Hard to do as a graduate student, even still, but
Sure.
and had a bumpy ride at times. But that also
Mhm.
helped me come home to doing Métis archaeology because that's not what my dissertation was about. But it sort of set me up on this path where I can now tell those stories and stand up and, being someone who's tenured and a full professor, and say, this is how I'm going to do archaeology. And that hopefully opens up space for others to follow in those footsteps.
Exactly. Thank you so much. We're right at 5 o'clock, and I want to be respectful of your time because I want you to come back and
Thanks, Liz.
and and hopefully arrange to have you come to Crow Canyon someday. That would just
That would be
be
lovely.
huge for all of us. So thank you so much, Dr. Supernant, and for the work that you're doing. It is incredibly inspirational and incredibly helpful to all of us practicing in the field right now. So
Yeah. Thanks for
thank you.
having me.
Have a wonderful evening. Bye bye.